All right. Well, welcome everybody. Today we are going to be talking about the DNA of a highly engaged culture. And I'm hoping that today's conversation is highly engaging. So feel free to jump in with questions and comments. We've got obviously the chat feature, but we're a small group today. So if you have questions and you want to just pipe right into the conversation, we're happy to have a conversation with you. Wanted to just quickly introduce myself. My name is Liz Scott, and I'm the CEO of Brighter Strategies. And I am joined today by Pyle Martin, who is going to be monitoring the chat and is going to be sort of co-hosting this with me. So Pyle, you want to say hey to everyone?
Hi, welcome. Thanks for joining.
Excellent. So I know everyone's probably really familiar with Zoom. We've been doing this since, early March. But again, if you have questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat, or there's also a raise your hand feature if you'd prefer to use that, if you want to jump into the conversation. And we'll try to obviously make this as engaging as possible. So thank you for joining us today. So what we wanted to talk about today was really talking about culture. So we wanted to have a conversation around what is it and how do we map it? How do we evaluate it within our organization? And one of the things that we've seen is with COVID and people working remotely, this issue of culture has become even more important. People are talking about really the sense of urgency around how do we evaluate our culture? How do we stay connected to people when we're not seeing them in the office? So we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the things that we've seen, and also to ground this conversation, Brighter Strategies did a culture assessment with about 30 nonprofits and looked at what are some of the elements that make for a good nonprofit culture. So what we wanted to do as part of today's conversation was talk a little bit about what culture is, share some of the results from the study that we did, and then talk about how we can use this information to develop clear communication plans and strategies to help us have some culture conversations with our staff in our workplace, given the current environment. And as I mentioned, we want this to be as interactive as possible, so feel free to jump in if you have questions or comments or anything that you think might help and contribute to today's conversation. So before I jump into sort of the meat of the presentation, I wanted to start with this notion of, when we talk about culture, what is it? And I would offer this visual as a starting point for us. So this fishbowl, imagine this is your organization. So you've got your employees, the fish that are sort of floating around within the organization. And what happens in pretty much every organization that we've ever worked with is one day you're floating around in your organization and somebody on the leadership team or somebody on the board suddenly sees a different fishbowl. They have a different vision for what they want the organization to be, to do, to look like. And the challenge here is we have to move our fish from one fishbowl to the other, right? We have to make some sort of a leap, if you will, some sort of a move, a transformation from being where we are today to where we want to be as an organization. And what we have found in Harvard Business Review did a whole study on this, and they found that 70% of change initiatives aren't successful. So 70% of these efforts to be and change from one thing to something else don't work the way that we want them to work. And so the question becomes why? Why are we not successful in these efforts? And what we at Brighter Strategies would offer is that in most cases, we haven't taken culture into consideration. So culture is something that really drives our ability to effectively make changes and to work within an organizational construct. So I want to take a moment here and just sort of define when I'm talking about culture, what am I talking about? Edgar Schein, who's a super famous researcher, he's written a bunch of books on culture. He said that culture is basically a pattern of shared assumptions, things that have worked well enough for us that we consider them to be valid, and therefore we teach them to new organizational members. And that's a really important thing to think about, this notion of that it's worked for us, and so we're teaching it to somebody else. So really, when we talk about culture, we're talking about behavior. Oftentimes when we think about culture, we think about an organization, we think about things like our mission or our leadership team and how we engage with one another. We might think about the work environment, our strategies, our goals, things of that sort. And those are things that, as a consultant, the way we are here at Brighter Strategies, or as a new employee, I might get a sense of those sorts of things within the first month of knowing an organization. But to really get into culture, to really get to the deeper stuff, it's going to take me probably 3 to 6 months to sort of learn the cultural norms, the things that are considered to be valid and then therefore taught to new employees. So what do I mean by that? I mean things like within your organization, is it expected of you to come up with new ideas? When you're in a meeting, are you supposed to brainstorm and bring new ideas to the table? Or when you sit in meetings, are you supposed to basically just sort of sit there and listen and not really bring anything to the table? Or, for example, are you in an organization where it's really important to plan ahead? So people do a lot of thinking around planning. They put together detailed project plans. Project management skills are considered something to be really important. There's a lot of meetings around planning and organizing. Or are you in an organization where it's a little bit more sort of fly by the seat of your pants, where people are taught to be a little bit more innovative? They don't really have to have a well thought out plan. They can just sort of jump into something and be innovative. And if it doesn't work out, that's okay from an organizational perspective. It's considered a learning opportunity. Are you in an organization where you are never supposed to make a mistake? You're always supposed to, do what's right and kind of think about things from a more risk management perspective? Or again, in an organization where being innovative and being transformational is seen as a value. So these are all things that we basically teach people in our workplaces around what's expected of us from a behavioral perspective. One of the best examples I can give you is I worked for an organization one time where being punctual, being on time, was a really important component of the behavior of the culture. And so I learned very quickly that if I was going to be late to a meeting, it was actually better to not attend the meeting than to walk in late. People who walked in late were often berated for showing up late. And so it was better to not be there and be missed than to sort of interrupt the whole group and walk in 10 minutes late. So I share this because I left that job and went to move on to another organization. And I had a meeting, and so I showed up. I was there 10 minutes early, and I was the only person in the room. And then the meeting time came around, and guess what? I was still the only person in the room. And I thought, oh gosh, this meeting must have been canceled. And then slowly, people started to trickle in. And I was like, oh, okay, the meeting's not canceled. And I learned that in that organization, time was not really an important value. It wasn't part of their culture. And so over time, I was taught that being punctual was not important, whereas in a previous job, being punctual was extremely important. So I offer that to say that we do teach our organizational members, our employees, these values, and we teach them to change their behavior based off of what we think is acceptable for our workplace. Now, a lot of organizations try to map culture, and they do engagement studies. So I don't know if anyone on this webinar has ever participated in an engagement study. My guess is you probably have. They're sort of popular. Gallup, which is a famous organization, they do a regular engagement survey that looks at overall engagement across the United States. And one of the things that's really interesting is if you look at the Gallup results over the last 15 years or so, what you'll see is that there really isn't a lot of variation. So we're somewhere between 25 and maybe 32% engaged as a workforce. And the question there, I think, is why? But then the other question is, I don't think we're really looking at culture here. We're looking at some of those other elements that I talked about earlier. People's sort of general satisfaction with the work, with benefits, with perks. And we're not really getting into sort of the behaviors of the workplace. So there's an assessment called the Organizational Culture Inventory, which really does get into not engagement, but really looks at culture, looks at behaviors and values and how people work together within the environment. And what it does is it looks at 12 different behaviors within the workplace. And I'll take a minute to kind of walk through this so that it makes sense. But what you're seeing in front of you, this circle, is called a circumplex. And when your staff take this assessment, it evaluates you against these 12 different components. So there are 10 questions for each of these wedges. So there's 12 wedges all the way around. So that's 120 questions. And it compares you against all the other organizations. So if you see this slightly darker circle here, which I'm moving my mouse around, so hopefully you can see that. This circle here is the 50th percentile. So this is sort of the average organization in the United States. So what this does is it compares you against everyone else and says, what does your culture look like in comparison to all these other organizations that have taken the assessment? And it's kind of a cool tool, but it hasn't been used a lot in the nonprofit space. So we approached the developers of this tool, Human Synergistics, and we said, so if the average organization, and this is really your average for-profit because that's their base, looks like this circle, we were curious to see, well, what does culture in the nonprofit space look like? How might it be different from a regular for-profit organization? So we embarked on this organizational assessment where we reached out to 30 different nonprofits here in the Washington, D.C. area, and we asked them to have their staff take this assessment so we could compare what does nonprofit culture actually look like. And so 30 organizations ended up being just about over 800 people who took this assessment. And I want to share those results with you, but before I do, I want to explain the circumplex so that you understand what it is that we're looking at, and that'll make the results a little bit clearer, I think, as well. So I'm going to delve into each of these areas. You will have noted that there were sort of three primary colors, blue, green, and red. And we're going to sort of take each of those sections one by one and walk through it together. And feel free to jump in if you have any questions around this. So the first section here is what they call these blue elements of culture. And typically more blue tends to be better. So wedge 11, so right here, it looks like a clock face if you follow the numbers around. So wedge 11 looks at achievement. So it's this question of our employees, do you understand what the goals are? And do you understand how your job is connected to those goals? So do you personally have a high sense of achievement that you can solve problems and get things done to help impact the work of your organization? Wedge number 12, again, another 10 questions here, looks at self-actualization. Does anyone remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs? If you ever took a psychology class, I'm seeing some heads nod, so yes, people know what I'm talking about. This really looks at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and the top of it, so that if you remember, it was a triangle, and at the bottom of the triangle were things like safety, shelter, food, you know, that sort of thing. And then as you move up, you reach what he called self-actualization. And so that's really what this is looking at, is as you as an employee, are you worried about your job security, safety? Oh my gosh, I might be fired. I'm, you know, got to kind of stay low and make sure that nobody really notices me because I don't want to rock the boat. Or do you feel fully self-actualized within your role, that you get enjoyment from your job and you would be willing to question something? You would be willing to sort of bring your full self and say, hey, I've got an idea and it may not be the best idea. And part of the argument here is that people who are self-actualized, who are willing to bring ideas to the table, aren't worried about the safety and security of their jobs. Whereas if you're worried about the security of your job, you're much less likely to try to rock the boat or bring something new because you want to kind of stay under the radar. And that's really what this wedge is looking at, is are people really engaged with the organization in a way that they would be willing to be a critical advocate around something. Wedge number 1 over here, this looks at, a terrible title, they call it humanistic encouraging, and I feel like they should probably just call that coaching, because that's really what this is about. So it's about, are we as an organization supportive? Are we constructive and open with one another? Do I go out of my way to coach people, not because I'm their manager, but because I actually value them and I want them to be successful? And in turn, do I expect people to coach me, not because they have to, but because they care about me and my development as an employee? So organizations with high levels of humanistic encouraging tend to be more learning organization oriented, and they're really focused on building capacity among employees and having people work together and encourage one another. So really focus on developing one another as individuals. And then the last piece here in the blue is affiliative, which actually goes back to on that Gallup, there's the Gallup 12. One of the questions that they ask on that is, do you have a friend at work? And people oftentimes sort of balk at that, like, why do I have to have a friend? You know, I don't need friends at work. And it turns out that we are social human beings. So we actually do want a sense of connectivity and friendship. We want people to know our names. When we come into work on Monday mornings, back when we were all in offices together, we want people to say, hey, Liz, how was your weekend? How was your dog? You know, what's happening with your mom? We don't want to just be a number. And so this idea of affiliation really looks at, is it a friendly environment? Are people open and willing to have friendships and engage with one another within the workplace? So what we see here is that organizations that have more blue, organizations that score highly in these 4 areas, in general tend to have higher levels of engagement surveys. So people tend to be happier, turnover is lower. They're in the for-profit world, they're financially more profitable. And in the nonprofit world, they tend to have better program outcomes. And so what that means is that they're more sustainable in the long run. They actually did a really interesting study a couple years ago where they looked at newspapers and they asked newspaper offices to take the organizational culture inventory, and they rated how blue the newspaper office was. And then they looked at readership levels and they asked readers of the newspaper which newspapers they preferred and why. And interestingly, what they found was that the bluer the home office, the higher levels of satisfaction and readability there was with readers. And what's really interesting about that is, as a consumer of a newspaper, you have absolutely no idea, nor do you probably care what the culture of the print shop office is. But what the study was able to prove was that because the culture was bluer, people were more able to work together and they produced a better product. And so they ended up with higher levels of satisfaction simply because their product was better. So there's something interesting to be said around that. Even in our own nonprofit space, you know, obviously we're not producing newspapers, but we are looking at having an impact in the world. And so the bluer our organization, the more impact we're going to have, which is sort of an interesting connection if you think about that. So I'm going to move on from blue. Blue is what we all strive for, I think. I'm going to talk a little bit about green here, which is what they call the passive elements of culture. And again, there's 4 here. So the first one, wedge number 3, is what they call approval. And this is similar to affiliation. So remember, affiliation was the sense of being friendly, being engaged, liking one another. Approval is where I so want you to like me, and I so want to gain your approval that I will sort of adjust my opinions to keep the status quo, which is not a bad thing. But if you have too much approval, then what ends up happening is that as a leader, for example, maybe I won't make a difficult decision because I don't really want to rock the boat. I won't really address someone's performance issue because I don't want them to not like me at the end of the day. Or I don't really want to have a difficult conversation with somebody because I'm worried about what the response is going to be. So a little bit of approval is not a bad thing. You'll see that with all of these green elements. A little bit isn't bad, but when you have too much of it, it sort of slows the organization down. Convention, wedge number 4, looks at rules. So as an organization, is it important that people conform and follow the rules? That it's important to make a good impression? Or is it okay if you're a rule breaker? Is it okay to be innovative and kind of be an out of the box thinker? So obviously, I think we would all agree that having some rules are important. But if we have too many rules and too much of a conforming sort of culture, then we probably don't get a lot done. And we probably are a little bit slower to move because we have a lot of process and a lot of red tape essentially that we have to cut through to get stuff done. Number 5, dependence. This area of the questionnaire looks at whether people are clear about what they're supposed to do, or whether they have to go through their supervisor to make sure that all decisions are cleared with them. And what's interesting about dependence is it's directly across from achievement. And what we see with anything that's blue, whatever is directly across from it, there's a little bit of a push-pull relationship that happens. So if, for example, I'm really high in achievement, I know what the mission is, I know what the goals are, I know what my job is, and I am empowered to get stuff done, I'm probably going to be relatively low in dependence because I know what I'm supposed to do. And so I don't need you to clear everything. I don't have to go through my supervisor. I'm empowered to do what I need to do. Whereas in the flip side, if I'm relatively low in achievement, I'm probably pretty high in dependence because I'm not really sure. So I'm going to run through Pile and make sure that she clears everything before I make a decision because, I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want to do it wrong. I don't want to rock the boat. I'm not really sure where my decision-making authority ends and where hers begins, as an example. And so I'm going to make sure I clear everything with her. I'm going to be highly dependent on her and her opinion to get stuff done. So again, you'll see there's a little bit of a push-pull there between anything that's blue and whatever is directly across from it. And then the last element here that's in green is avoidance. And that is exactly what it sounds like. So some organizations, we avoid conflict, we avoid difficult conversations, we shift responsibility and want to make sure that we're not being blamed for any mistakes. We're always kind of making sure that everyone's happy. And again, you'll see avoidance is directly across from self-actualization because again, there's a push-pull relationship. If I am fully self-actualized, I'm not afraid to bring a critical issue or a challenge to the table. I'm not going to avoid it because I know my opinion counts. Whereas if I'm not self-actualized and I'm concerned about my job security, I'm probably going to avoid that difficult issue because I don't want to get in the middle of it. It's not really my problem. I don't want to get in trouble, And so again, these are behaviors that we teach people within our organizations. People don't naturally come in being avoidant or being dependent. They learn those behaviors because, as Shine said, they learn them because other people within the organization tell them, this is how you have to behave to be successful here. This is what works. And so people learn over time to sort of take on some of these behaviors that, given a different environment, they maybe wouldn't take those behaviors on. What we see with organizations that are really green is that they're kind of slow moving. They tend to be a little bit more bureaucratic. They tend to be very process oriented. They are very focused on sort of status quo. People describe green organizations as good places to work, but not great places to work. They're kind of slow and steady, not really innovative, but not terrible either. So, are avoiding some issues sometimes the right decision? Yeah. Do you want some level of dependence between your employees? Probably. Do you want some sense of rules? Yes. Do you want some sense of approval between people? Probably, yeah. But the question is how much of that is appropriate before you start losing your ability to be innovative or to, be a risk taker and push your organization forward. Any questions about the blue or the green before I move on? Kyle, anything coming up in the chat? I don't think so. No. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to move on to the last part, and then we're going to jump into the survey results, which is really the more interesting part here. So the last four, number 7, wedge 7, is oppositional. So that looks at whether we within the organization expect people to criticize, to point out where there might be flaws, where we're asking people to be a critical advocate, to challenge one another. And again, a little bit of this isn't bad. If you actually look at, they've done this OCI circumplex looking not at organizations, but at cultures. And what they find is that in the US culture, we actually value more opposition than, say, in like East Asian cultures, as an example. So we do like a little bit of that devil's advocate, pushback sort of thing. But the reality is if somebody is constantly being oppositional, they're constantly pushing back in a meeting, then that becomes a little bit more difficult. That becomes,
You're not even letting.
I'm going to mute everybody here for a second. All right, so everybody is muted. So if you'd like to unmute yourself, if you have a question, feel free to do so. Um,
There is one question in the box. Someone wanted to ask where the circumplex model came from.
Oh, so the circumplex model, that's a great question. It was developed by human synergistics, and it was based off of the work actually of Edgar Schein and a couple other cultural researchers. So they looked at what are the different components where researchers agree on cultural behavioral norms, and then they pulled those together to create this tool. So it's actually a pretty well validated and researched tool, and I can definitely give people more information about that if they're interested. Thanks, Pyle. So let's see, we talked about oppositional. So we'll talk about power, which is the next one. So power looks at whether whether the organization is sort of command and control oriented, or whether it's a little bit more distributive in power. So some organizations are highly autocratic. There's a few people hold a lot of the power within the organization. And then in other organizations, it's sort of distributed across the organization. I remember early in my career, I worked for a really big consulting firm, and I was showing up to another meeting story, but I was showing up to a meeting, and they had chairs that were sitting around the table, and then there were chairs that were sitting around the perimeter of the room. And I was told by the person that I entered with that because I was a junior employee, that I should sit not at the table, but at one of the chairs around the perimeter, and I shouldn't talk. That wasn't my job. I was just there to be amazed by the conversation and to listen and learn and absorb, I guess. And that's an example of a high power organization where you have people who are empowered to be in the meeting and part of the conversation, and then other people who are basically told, you can sit and watch, but you're not actually allowed to jump into this conversation. You also see power displayed in organizations around like who has an office with a door versus who has a cubicle. Some organizations everyone kind of sits anywhere, whereas other organizations, it's very clear that if you have a door in an office, you are in a power position compared to other people. I've done a fair amount of work in academia, and I can tell you that one of the power elements there is that if Pyle and I, for example, are colleagues, and we have offices right next to one another, we're equal on the totem pole, but I have a PhD and she doesn't, I would be referred to as Dr. Scott in a meeting, and she would be referred to as Pyle in a meeting. And it's a way of differentiating the haves and the have-nots, essentially, between those who have degrees and those who don't. And that's a standard practice in academia, one that I think some organizations are trying to break. But that's a power symbol. It's to denote who holds more power in that meeting and in that conversation. And interestingly, Pyle might actually be senior to me, but we would still be calling her Pyle and still be calling me Dr. Scott, just so that, because that's a cultural norm that we want to point out those power relationships. Okay, so let me move on. The next one, competitive, that is what it sounds like. So some organizations create sort of a win-lose, whereas other organizations tend to be a little bit more collaborative with one another. I remember I was talking to a client one time who explained their budget process to me. This is a very large association with, thousands and thousands and thousands of members. They probably have about 200 staff and about 20-ish people on the leadership team. And they explain their budget process that they literally all get into a room, the 20 leaders, for 3 days. They lock themselves into a room and they argue over budgets. And then basically whoever is left standing at the end gets the budget that they want, and everything else kind of falls to the other departments. And I said, that sounds terrible. And she said, oh, it's just highly competitive and people are, going after and pitting one another. And I asked her, how do you feel about that? And she said, I have a terrible stomach ache the entire time because I know this budget meeting is going to come. And I know that it's going to be this sort of fight for resources. And that's an example of a very competitive organization where people are basically being told, instead of working together to figure out the right budget, you need to fight for your department because it's a win-lose. And so that's how they set that up, which sounds incredibly painful from my perspective and from hers, judging by the story she shared. The last section here is perfectionistic. And perfectionistic organizations are organizations where we are not allowed to make mistakes. We expect people to work really long hours, stay on top of everything. These are what I tend to think of as being very busy organizations, but not necessarily productive or strategic. They're just always doing something. I remember one time I met with a client for a consulting kickoff meeting, and a number of people showed up to the meeting, and they sat down at the table, and I started to introduce myself, and they immediately pulled up their laptops and they were clicking away and they were typing the entire kickoff meeting. And they were all like checking email and doing stuff while they were having this conversation with me. That is an extreme example of a highly perfectionistic organization that is so busy they can't even have a 1-hour meeting where they're focused on something because they're doing multiple things multiple times. What we find about organizations that are mostly red is that they're really volatile. They tend to have, they go through staff, they churn, they go up and down. So a little bit of this red aggressive behavior can actually light some fire under you, and some people thrive in that sort of aggressive experience, but they also burn out quickly in that same cultural environment. So what happens is you do really well as an organization, and then a bunch of people quit because they're exhausted and they just can't do it anymore. So then you hire new people and they ramp up and they do really well for a little bit, but then they quit. And so it's this constant up and down volatility that the organization experiences. So let me move on here and talk a little bit about how we apply this to an organization. So if you think about an organization, you've got you, your manager, leadership, you probably have some teams that makes up your organization. If I am green as an example, so I'm sort of passive, I like rules, I like order, I'm a little slow to act, and Pyle is my manager and we're both green, we probably work together really well. You know, we like setting process and creating order and strategy, and that works really well. But if we're working for a green or for a red leader, that leader is probably wondering why we're slow and why we're not innovative and why we just can't do stuff and get stuff done. And if the team is red, then ultimately there ends up being some culture clashes in the values and the behaviors of how we work together, because we have different expectations for what we want out of our work relationship. And the reality is, for most of us, we're not structured this way. We're structured more like this. You probably have more employees than just 2 or 3. And so you have people that are representing all of these different components within your organization. So one of the things that is sort of interesting about the assessment is it gives you a moment to kind of think about what do we think the predominant color of our organization is? And the reality is you're going to be all 3. You're going to have components of blue, green, and red within your organization. But what I wondered is if we could just take a minute in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, I'd love to hear from people what your perspective is. Do you see yourself as being predominantly blue, green, or red? Have you experienced some of this cultural behavioral divides within your organization? Anyone want to take a stab at it from your perspective?
I can go.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Samantha.
So our nonprofit is a pro bono legal services for journalists. So half of the staff are attorneys and they come from big law firms. So they carry that mentality with them. So I would say half of our staff is very red. And then the other half of nonprofit professionals, including operations, communications, development, we work very much in a blue-green sort of way.
Mm-hmm.
Comes to meshing those 2 styles together, it can get a little problematic, and we're sort of trying to filter through that now.
Yeah, that's actually a really great description, the way you gave it, because I think that's sort of what happens with most organizations. You're not all one or the other, and you do have some sort of clashes. And it's interesting because they've done a number of studies, and law firms are always really red. That's just sort of their culture, and you know, they're taught to think that way. And so they, even in a nonprofit, they bring that to the table because that's the way their mindset has been. So that's really interesting. Thank you, Samantha. Anyone else want to take a stab or think about their own organization? Nope.
I'll make a comment. I'm not sure. I'm Meg Porter. I'm with the NEA Foundation. I'm not sure which I think we're dominant in overall, but one thing that I've noticed in the last few months since we've been all working from home remotely, and also because we've been having to make pivots in our work, is that some of the people that I work with who very much are in the green area, they're having a harder time sort of pivoting on things, and that's created some tension at times of them wanting to stick with the process that's in place and what they've been doing, and sort of kind of they've come along, but it's been a harder thing for them to do.
Yeah. Interesting. Thanks, Meg. It's nice to see you. Let's see, Kathleen, were you going to say something?
Yes, I was going to say it's very interesting to see this actually put in a concept. I've been working most recently as an interim executive director. And so I think some of my assumptions from the organizations I've led long-term are primarily blue. And then the challenge as an interim is to try to quickly figure out what's going on in the red or too much green, and then try to help the organization move itself a little more blue. So yeah, thank you for this model. I'm going to spend some more time thinking about it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, we've got a lot more to share here. So thank you for those who made comments. And if other people would like to, feel free, of course, to jump in. So as I mentioned, we did this study where we looked at 30 different nonprofits, and I'll show you those results in a moment here. But if you remember my fishbowl analogy that I started with earlier, this is why we at Brighter Strategies think culture is so important, because what happens is you have the culture that you want. You've got this ideal that you sort of create, and for the purposes of our description today, as you can see on the slide, what I want is a lot of blue, and I've got a little bit of red and green in there, but that's really what I'm shooting for, is what we have on the left here. This is my ideal. And then as a nonprofit, I have a mission and a philosophy as to how I'm going to get my work done. I create goals and strategies. I have a strategic plan, hopefully. And then I start hiring staff, and I build my organization, and I create some structures, and I introduce new systems, and I bring in technologies, and then I start training my staff and developing their skills. And ultimately, all of that work gets filtered into what our current culture actually is. And what we see here is if there's a disconnect between our ideal culture and our current culture, that impacts our outcomes. So individual, group, or organizational level outcomes get impacted, usually in a negative sense. And so what happens is that most organizations then say, they see a new fishbowl and they say, well, I'd like to make a change. I'd like to do something different. And so maybe, I'm sure if you've worked with more than one organization, you've seen plenty of restructures happen in your career. So what happens is we come into an organization and we say, okay, these outcomes aren't where we want them, so let's restructure. That'll fix it. Let's move the boxes around, and then that'll create better outcomes as an organization. Or we introduce a new system, a new process, a new technology, a new way of getting something done. Or we say, what we really need is a CRM. If we could just get the CRM in, that would change everything. Or my favorite is, we're having a lot of issues with red. There's a lot of competitive sort of aggressiveness happening. People don't know how to have difficult conversations. So let's bring in a consultant to do a half-day conflict management training. And that's going to fix this for us. And what happens is that's why 75% of these change initiatives don't fail, because we start messing with this stuff in the middle, which is what a lot of management consulting is frankly about, without taking culture into consideration. So is it bad to restructure your organization or to introduce a new technology or to train your staff? Absolutely not. Those are all wonderful interventions. But if they're not taken in context of the broader culture, if you're not thinking about the culture work and the behavioral norms, then I can rearrange you as many times as I want. It's probably not going to be terribly successful. And so this culture work, as part of our work doing capacity building and organizational design with our clients, we always want to kind of look at it from a culture lens to say, whatever intervention we're planning, how does the culture fit into this? What is going to work for this client? And what works in one organization is not necessarily going to work in the other. So we reached out to these nonprofits and we said, what is the ideal for the nonprofit space? And what are you currently experiencing? And what do your outcomes look like? Are you successful or not? Because we kind of wanted to test this model to see, does this really make sense from an organizational perspective? And so this slide is what we found. This is the ideal for a nonprofit. So this is what people wanted. You can see there's a lot of blue, a little bit of red and green, and I love this little extension into opposition here. So people say, yes, we do want some critical thinkers who push back, but we don't want, you know, a lot of aggressiveness, but we do want some. In general, we tend to not want a lot of constrictive rules. We tend to be more, we want to be more innovative as a nonprofit. And then to no surprise, we want a lot of blue. So, you know, if this is average here, you can see we want a lot more blue than what an average organization might have. So we asked these organizations, these 800 and some odd employees, to take this assessment twice. Once for what is your ideal, which is what you're looking at right now. And then once for what does your current environment actually look like? And so what you see here on the left side of the screen, this is current nonprofit environment for those organizations. And then on the right is the ideal. Now, what's interesting about this is that we see that nonprofits, if you look at perfectionistic, we're busy. We're very busy. We're doing a lot of things. We're busier than we want to be. Interestingly, we're just as busy as our for-profit counterparts, but we'd like to be a lot less busy and a lot more strategic. We also tend to have about just as much green as the for-profits, but we do tend to avoid a little bit more. We're a little bit more focused on sort of avoiding issues as opposed to directly confronting issues. But what's really interesting here is if this is sort of average, you can see for goals and achievement, we're about on track. A little bit lower for self-actualizing, which is not surprising given the extension here into avoidance. But what's interesting here is if you look at the humanistic, encouraging, and affiliative, so coaching and developing people and being connected, we actually score a lot higher than our for-profit counterparts in those two areas. And I can share from my own personal experience, my first job in a nonprofit, I did not really have the skills to do the job that I was hired to do, but I was a good fit for the mission. And they liked me in the interview, and that goes a long way. And I remember the person who hired me said, Liz, you don't have the skills, but we'll coach and develop you and build you into this role because we like you and we like that you have a passion for the mission. And that's what this is. This is our interest in coaching and developing staff and building them. And this sense of connectivity to mission is really important because it creates an automatic sort of connection for people. So I thought that was kind of interesting. We took the data and we segmented it by industry because we know that although the world thinks nonprofits are one industry, we are not. There are lots of different industries here. So you can see some of the examples here. So Meg, I know you said that you're with education, and so the NEA Foundation. So you can see this is the education circle down here. Interestingly, Samantha was talking about working with lawyers. So here's community and civic engagement, which is sort of that category that I would put your organization in without knowing exactly what you do, but you can see some of the differences here. So, you know, interestingly, community and civic engagement, we talked about this with Samantha's comment, but they tend to be very, very busy because they are constantly putting out fires and dealing with issues. They hire people who are advocates and agitators, and they just can't turn that off. So they just tend to be redder in general. Domestic violence was really interesting. Look at all that blue and almost no red. And one of the things we learned with the domestic violence groups is that they are dealing with people who are experiencing trauma. And so they are very careful about who they hire and the behaviors that they engage in the workplace because they don't want to trigger someone's trauma. So they actually weed out the red and don't hire red people. So that was really interesting. The other ones, education and homelessness and housing, we were surprised by really how much of almost a circle that is when you look at particularly homelessness and housing. It's almost on par with the for-profit company. And we realized that in a lot of cases in homelessness and housing, they're really landlords. They're dealing with buildings and maintenance issues. And so while they're engaging in mission work, it feels more transactional to a lot of the employees, depending on what they're doing within the organization. And the same thing with education. Education tends to feel a little bit more transactional because we're trying to recruit students, bring students in. It's a numbers game. How many people do we have and going through our system? So it's just sort of interesting when you look at different sectors within the nonprofit space that their current realities tend to look very different. We can definitely get these slides out to everybody as well so that you can study this a little bit more if you'd like to look at it in a little bit more detail. We also looked at, if you remember, I mentioned we asked this question around, are you meeting your goals? Are you getting things done that you as an organization want to get done? And so for highly constructive organizations, for organizations that are doing the work that they want to be doing, they're happy with their outcomes, their current and their ideal were much more aligned. That's the group on the left. The group that was less constructive, that were not necessarily meeting their goals, you can see their current culture on the right. There's a really big difference here. So this goes back to the newspaper story I was saying. Organizations that are bluer tend to have better results. So these organizations that were more constructive are having better impact, better results in the world, whereas the organizations on the right here are experiencing a different type of culture, and they're not necessarily having the impact that they want to be having in the world. A lot less blue and a lot more red and green, which I think is fascinating. So we reached out to the organizations that were doing really well, that had a lot of blue, and we said, what are you doing? Because we want, what's the secret sauce, basically? What are you doing that other organizations should be doing? And there were 5 things. So we did interviews with all of them. And there were 5 things that were commonly shared across all the different organizations. The first thing was that people talked about that they infuse fun and camaraderie into their work. So they spend time getting to know employees, spending time together. They had different ways of doing this. Like one group had puzzles around the office where people could fill, do a little piece of the puzzle. There was another group that had chat and chocolate every Thursday. And so people could get together and chit chat. And so sort of built-in social engagement. There was one nonprofit that their mission is around food and healthy eating. And their entire company of 40 people, they all eat lunch together every day. Everybody. It's just part of their culture. Now, most of us aren't in environments where we could do that. But the point is that they all had some intentionality around how do we infuse fun and creativity. And it wasn't like happy hour after work or a baseball game on a Saturday. It was part of the daily work ritual. The second thing that we found is that these organizations, the bluer ones, focused a lot more time and attention on self-care and work-life balance. So people took vacations. One group did mindfulness training, another group had yoga, but they really spent time making sure that people were being taken care of emotionally and physically, and not just focused on their job as an employee. The third thing was that these organizations had empowered staff to carry out the mission on their own. So they had different models and tools, but they all had a very clear decision-making structure. Some people used MOCA, some people used RACI models. There's different methods out there for decision-making trees and structures, but they all had something where people were empowered to do what they needed to do without going to management, and management didn't second-guess their choices and options. They knew who had authority and where that authority rested. The fourth thing was that these organizations invested a lot of time and effort in careful hiring. They were not looking for bodies. They were looking for people who really would embed themselves into the mission and the values of the organization. They had very long onboarding processes. A number of them did regular pulse checks, a lot of ongoing training. One person said to us that if somebody wasn't a good fit by 90 days, they were out. And the person joked that employees were not like wine. They didn't get better with time. That if you didn't get your best shot within those first 90 days, that the person wasn't going to improve beyond that. And I thought that was kind of interesting. I mean, they're really putting an effort to focus on bringing people in and onboarding them and making sure that they understand the values and the work of the organization. And then the last thing that we saw was regular and ongoing two-way feedback. So people had clear communication plans where information flowed up and down throughout the organization and people understood what was happening. So the last thing we asked them is, how many of you have some sort of a culture initiative? Like, you're talking about culture, you're doing something about culture. And it turned out there were 8 organizations that had some sort of an active culture initiative and 20 organizations that did not. Now, what's interesting about this is the 20 organizations that did not almost look like a ball. They almost look like an average organization. Not good, not bad, just average. The 8 organizations that did have some sort of a culture initiative, look at their culture, totally different. So this goes back to the whole notion, it's like dieting. If you are on a diet and you're mindful about what you're eating, statistically you weigh less than someone who is not being mindful about what they're eating. And the same idea here, it didn't matter what the culture initiative was, if you're mindful of culture and you're talking about it with your staff, you're more likely to have a better, more engaged culture. So you might be asking, how is this relevant today, right? Because things have changed. We're experiencing this increased sense of urgency. We need to improve collaboration, adaptability. We're all engaged in working from home. We have a pandemic around us. So how do we apply some of these cultural values into kind of where we find ourselves today? So I just wanted to spend kind of a minute here talking about this, because we've reached back out to organizations, to many of our clients, and we are seeing some interesting cultural patterns that are popping up. The first thing is that there is a real sense of urgency to focus on sometimes new, sometimes old priorities, but people are really thinking about strategy, and they're thinking about how work flows and how people engage with one another, and particularly with people working from home. There has been a heightened practice of demonstrating empathy and concern for people, because people are engaging with this work and dealing with working from home and pandemic and people being sick in different ways. So the sense of self-care and really focusing on empathy has been something that has been important and paramount for our clients. We've also seen a desire to really define values, to think about, as we're disconnected from one another in our respective homes, how do we find connectivity and work together? We've also seen higher levels of innovation and creativity. How do we work differently given this environment that we're in? And lastly, more inclusive communications between leaders and staff, which is a very positive thing. So a lot of organizations are going out of their way to make sure that there's more communication, more sort of connectivity between people. So I wondered if anyone had any sort of thoughts around, given our current reality, is there anything that you're noticing about your culture that might have changed or been different? Or, do the things on this slide, does this resonate? Are you seeing some of these things happen within your own organization? So I don't know if anyone wants to take a stab at this, or if you just want to ponder it in your head, that's fine too. Anyone want to offer anything? So I think it's just, it's good to think about, how are we seeing within our own organization, how are you seeing culture manifest, particularly given our environment? So for those of you who maybe haven't had this conversation yet, or you haven't really begun to think about it, we wanted to offer a way for you potentially to think about moving forward. So Human Synergistics, with their OCI, has developed what they're calling the COVID-19 Culture Mirror. And it's basically the OCI assessment, but a drilled down version that specifically focuses on adaptability, flexibility, and collaboration. So it's really looking at how people are engaging and working together within the organization, and they're offering it as about half the price of what they normally offer it for. So normally it's about $5,000 for the assessment, and then there's a per person cost. And they're offering this for about half that. And if you're a nonprofit, they're also offering a 25% discount on top of that. So might be something to think about. But whether you decide to take the assessment or not, I think having a conversation as a team and thinking about, what's working and what's not working within our culture is really important, and begin to think about, from your perspective, what have you seen change because of this COVID environment? If you choose to take an assessment, that information can obviously give you some useful data points. But even if you just have that conversation internally, what we're encouraging people to do is really to try to think through what are some of the lessons learned and how do we apply some of these culture conversations to the work that we have now. So one of the things that we did, if you go to our website, if you go to this link, we created this comparative tool to help you think about, it's free, you can go to the website and just download it, but to help you think about, for different elements of your organization, what was sort of the normal status, how was culture manifesting and engaging within your organization, and then what's the COVID-19 status? How are we seeing culture influenced or impacted with where we are today? So looking at something like team behavior. How did we interact with one another when we were in the office? How are we interacting with one another today? And then from your perspective, is the trend, is it better or worse, or is it sort of the same? And so we offer this as a tool for you to engage with your teams, to begin to have this conversation around culture and to get a sense of sort of what's working and what's not working. Because as we've realized that, this is sort of a new normal for us. We unfortunately, I think, are going to be dealing with the ramifications of COVID for quite some time. It's not like everyone's going back to the office on Monday. So beginning to think about, as an organization, are we more red? Are we more blue? Are we more green? And then how does that manifest in the current environment? And what are some tactics and techniques that we might use that would help us engage in this conversation? And I go back to the slide from a couple of slides ago, that simply having a conversation about culture, simply engaging in that discussion by default makes you a bluer organization, which is a really positive thing. So we have a couple moments left. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer those. I did also want to put up our website, and if you go to brighterstrategies.com/contact, there is an opportunity there if you would like a 1-hour free consultation to talk about culture. If you've downloaded that form, you want to kind of talk through what to do with it or how to have this conversation, we're offering these 1-hour consultations. So you can go there and fill in your information. There's a little check the box that you are requesting a 1-hour free consultation, and then you'll be put in touch with one of our consultants. So
it's a really interesting question in the box right now from Deborah. And she says, given observing what's happening now and the conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion, how does that play a role in an organization's culture?
That's a great question. I think that with diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's a value that I think lives, I would say, in the blue, right? It lives in that area around being self-actualized and having critical conversations and having a sense of inclusion and focus where people feel like they can bring their full selves to work and be fully engaged in the work. And I think, what we've seen is that this area around self-actualization, and actually a lot of our clients, if they do take the OCI, they will look at it from different demographic perspectives. So different racial backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, gender backgrounds, just to see, are there differences in our staff and how they're experiencing the culture within the workforce. And what we see is that area around self-actualization can be one of those areas that if people don't feel included, then they tend to not be as self-actualized in that space. So it definitely is a tool. It's not a DEI specific tool, but it is something that could be used to kind of explore some of those conversations and to give you a little bit of data. That's a great question. Thank you.
I think you can really look at if you do the tool, like specific questions and hone in on some issues like whether or not people feel comfortable being themselves at work. I believe there's a question somewhere near that, that we could, if you took it, you can see everyone's results by question and really drill down into some of the elements on DEI that are really specific and behaviors that are causing some of those things, to start thinking about solutions about how you might solve them.
Yeah, that's a good point. We also had a client that was in the midst of a DEI initiative, and we added a number of custom questions to the assessment, which drilled even more specifically into those areas that they wanted to focus on. And so that data can be used as sort of a comparative or complementary, I guess, analysis looking at the culture piece as well. So great, thank you. Well, if people have questions, we're happy to stick around and answer them. Otherwise, we thank you for giving us an hour of your time and hope that you found value out of the slides. We'll be posting the slides as well as we've recorded the presentation. So if you want to go back and watch pieces of it again, you're more than welcome to. And thank you again for being a part of today.